Hello! Hello, my friends of Gig Workshop! Welcome to these scary readings. The scary readings of Halloween. Today, I am going to continue reading more chapters of these. The Monkey's Paw. Are you guys ready? Here we go. Chapter 3. It was nearly midnight. In their warm living room, the two old people and their son sat and talked about the soldiers' stories. India is a wonderful country, Mr. White said. What exciting stories! It was a good evening. Mrs. White stood up to take some things into the kitchen, but she stopped and listened to Herbert and his father. Yes, Herbert said. Maurice told some interesting stories, but of course, some of them weren't true. Oh, Herbie! Mrs. White said. Well, Mother, that story about the monkey's paw wasn't true. A dirty little monkey's paw isn't magic. But it was a good story, and Herbert smiled. Well, I think you're right, Herbert, his mother said. I don't know, Mr. White said quietly. Perhaps the story was true. Strange things can happen sometimes. Mrs. White looked at her husband. Did you give some money to Tom Morris for that paw? She asked. We don't have money to give away for nothing. Mrs. White was angry now. Well, yes, her husband answered. I did, but not much. And at first, he didn't want to take it. He wanted the monkey's paw. Well, he can have it, Herbert laughed. It's our paw now, and we're going to be rich and happy. Come on, father, make a wish. Old Mr. White took the paw from his pocket. Okay, Herbert, but what am I going to ask for? I have everything. You, your mother. What do I need? Money, of course, Herbert answered quickly. We need money! You're always thinking about money. That's because we haven't got very much of it. With money, you can pay for this house. It can be your house. Go on, father. Wish for 30,000 pounds. Herbert stopped talking and his old father thought for a minute. The room was quiet and they could hear the rain on the windows. Then Mr. White took the monkey's paw in his right hand. He was afraid, but he looked at his wife and she smiled at him. Go on, she said. Slowly and carefully, Mr. White said, I wish for 30,000 pounds. Suddenly, he gave a cry and Mrs. White and Herbert ran to him. What's the matter, father? Herbert asked. It moved, Mr. White cried. The monkey's paw, it moved. They looked at the paw. It was now on the floor and not in the old man's hand. The family watched and they waited, but it didn't move again. So the little family sat down again and they waited. Nothing happened. The noise of the rain on the windows was worse now in their little living room did not feel nice and warm. Mrs. White said, "It's cool! Let's go to bed!" Mr. White did not answer, and in the end, Herbert said, "Well, there's no money, Father. Your friend's story wasn't true." But Mr. White did not answer. He sat quietly and said nothing. After some time, Mrs. White said to her husband, "Are you okay?" "Yes, yes," the old man answered. "But for a minute or two, I was afraid." "Well, we needed that money," Mrs. White said. "But we are going to get it. I'm tired. I'm going to bed." After Mrs. White went to bed, the two men sat and smoked for some time. Then Herbert said, "Well, Father, I'm going to bed too. Perhaps the money is in a bag under your bed. Good night, Father." And Herbert laughed and went out of the room. Old Mr. White sat in the cold living room for a long time. The candle died and it was dark. Suddenly, the old man saw a face at the window. Quickly he looked again, but there was nothing there. He felt afraid. Slowly he stood up and left the cold, dark room. Chapter 4. The next morning, the winter sun came through the window, and the house felt nice and warm again. Mr. White felt better, and he smiled at his wife and son. The family sat down to have breakfast, and they began to talk about the day. The monkey's paw was on a little table near the window, but nobody looked at it. And nobody thought about it. "I'm going to the shops this morning," Mrs. White said. "I want to get something nice for dinner. Are you going to come with me?" she asked her husband. "No, I'm going to have a quiet morning. I'm going to read," her husband answered. "Well, I'm not going to go out this evening," Herbert said, "so we can go to bed early tonight. We were very late last night, and we aren't going to have stories about monkeys' paws," Mrs. White said. She was angry. "Why did we listen to your friend?" she asked her husband. "A monkey's paw can give you things." She stopped, but the two men did not answer her. £30,000, she said quietly. "We needed that money." Just then, Herbert looked at the clock and stood up. "I'm going to work," he said. "Perhaps the postman has got the money for you in a letter. Remember, I want some of it too." Herbert laughed, and his mother laughed too. "Don't laugh, son," Mr. White said. "Tom Morris is an old friend, and he thinks this story is true. Perhaps it is." "Well, leave some of the money for me." Herbert laughed again. His mother laughed too, and she went to the door with him. "Goodbye, Mother," Herbert said happily. "Get something nice for dinner this evening at the shops. I'm always hungry after a day at work." "I know you are," Mrs. White answered. Herbert left the house and walked quickly down the road. His mother stood at the door for some time and watched him. The winter sun was warm, but suddenly she felt very cold. Chapter 5. Slowly, old Mrs. White went back into the house. Her husband looked up and saw something strange in her face. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Nothing," his wife answered, and she sat down to finish her breakfast. She began to think about Tom Morris again, and suddenly she said to her husband, "Your friend drank a lot of whiskey last night. A monkey's paw. What a story!" Mr. White did not answer her because just then the postman arrived. He brought 2 letters for them, but there was no money in them. After breakfast, the 2 old people forgot about the money and the monkey's paw. Later in the day, at about 1 o'clock, Mr. and Mrs. White sat down to eat, and then they began to talk about money again. They did not have very much money, so they often needed to talk about it. "That 30,000 pounds, Mrs. White said. "We need it." "But it didn't come this morning," her husband answered. "Let's forget it." Then he said, "But that thing moved. The monkey's paw moved in my hand. Tom's story was true. You drank a lot of whiskey last night. Perhaps the paw didn't move," Mrs. White answered. "It moved!" Mr. White cried angrily. At first, his wife did not answer, but then she said, "Well, Herbert laughed about it." Suddenly, she stopped talking. She stood up and went over the window. "What's the matter?" her husband asked. "There's a man in front of our house," Mrs. White answered. "He's a stranger, very tall and well dressed. He's looking at our house." "Oh no, it's okay. He's going away." "Come and sit down. Finish eating," Mr. White said. The old woman did not listen to her husband. "He isn't going away," she went on. "He's coming back. I don't know him. He's a stranger. Yes, he's very well dressed." Suddenly, Mrs. White stopped. She was very excited. "He's coming to the door. Perhaps he's bringing the money." And she ran out of the room to open the front door. The tall, well-dressed stranger stood there. For a minute he said nothing, but then he began. "Good afternoon. I'm looking for Mr. and Mrs. White." "Well, I'm Mrs. White," the old woman answered. "What can I do for you?" At first, the stranger did not answer, but then he said, "Mrs. White, I'm from Mo and Megan's. Can I come in and talk to you?" Mo and Megan's had a big factory, and Herbert White worked there on the machinery. "Yes, of course," Mrs. White answered. "Please come in." The well-dressed stranger came into the living room, and Mr. White stood up. "Are you Mr. White?" the stranger began. Then he went on. "I'm from Mo and Megan's." Mrs. White looked at the stranger and she thought, perhaps he has the money, but why Mo and Megan's? And his face is very unhappy. Why? Suddenly, the old woman was afraid. "Please sit down," Mr. White began, but now his wife could not wait. "What's the matter?" she cried. "It's Herbert." She could not finish the question. The stranger did not look at their faces, and Mr. White began to be afraid too. Please tell us," he said. "I'm very sorry," the man from Mo and Megan's began. He stopped for a minute, and then he began again. "I'm very sorry, but this morning there was an accident at the factory." "What's the matter? Is Herbert okay?" Mrs. White cried again. "Well," the man began slowly. "Is he in the hospital?" the old woman asked, very afraid now. "Yes, but..." The stranger looked at Mrs. White's face and stopped. Is he dead? Is Herbert dead? Mr. White asked quietly. Dead! Mrs. White cried. Oh no! Please! Not dead! Not Herbert! Not our son! Suddenly, the old woman stopped because she saw the stranger's face. Then the two old people knew their son was dead. Old Mrs. White began to cry quietly, and Mr. White put his arm around her. Some time later, the man from Mo and Megan's said, it was the machinery, an accident. Herbert called, help! The man heard him and ran to him quickly, but they could do nothing. The next minute, he was in the machinery. I'm very, very sorry, he finished. For a minute or two, the room was quiet. At last, Mrs. White said, our son, dead. We're never going to see him again. What are we going to do without him? Her husband said, he was our son. We loved him. Then Mrs. White asked the stranger, can we see him? Can we see our son? Please take me to him. I want to see my son. But the stranger answered quickly, no, he said. It's better not to see him. They couldn't stop the machinery quickly. He was in there for a long time, and at first they couldn't get him out. The man stopped. Then he said, don't go to see him. The stranger went over to the window because he did not want to see the faces of the two old people. He said nothing, but he stood there for some time and he waited. Then he went back to the old people and began to talk again. There's one more thing, he said. Your son worked for Mo and Megan's for 6 years, and he was a good worker. Now, Mo and Megan's want to help you at this unhappy time. Again, the stranger stopped. After a minute, he began again. Mo and Megan's want to give you some money. Then he put something into Mr. White's hand. Old Mr. White did not look at the money in his hand. Slowly, he stood up and looked at the stranger, afraid. How much? Mr. White asked very quietly. He did not want to hear the answer. 30,000 pounds, the stranger said. And that, my friends, is the end of these 3 chapters from The Monkey's Paw. Tomorrow, I will finish this fantastic and scary story. In the meantime, have a nice Saturday. Enjoy your weekend. And stay tuned tomorrow for this story, The Monkey's Paw. Tomorrow, my friends, have a nice weekend. So long. Enjoy your Saturday. Bye-bye. Take care.